Here to provide more information and clarity is employment lawyer Lior Samfiru. Hello, Lior. Great to see you again.
Good morning. Great to see you.
As always, Lior. So let's get started by asking what this means for federal workers in the air, rail, and marine transportation sectors, and also what happens if their employer doesn't bring them back from their unpaid leave.
So, Candace, certainly this is big news for these employees. For those employees that are unionized that have been off work, they have to legally now be brought back, certainly based on their seniority. So you're essentially guaranteed your job back as a unionized employee. For a non-unionized employee, still big news, but here's what can happen. Either you are brought back to work or your employment is terminated with severance. So no longer are you going to be off without compensation, wondering what happens. You're either brought back or paid. So for all these employees, it's big news, and they're certainly not going to be left out there anymore. They're going to see changes and potentially compensation right away.
Now, the other question, so there's federal employees, but there's also federally regulated employees. A lot of these companies across the country, we're talking banking, even broadcasting, you name it, had reflective policies. What happens to them? And I'm also curious, in light of all of these wrongful dismissal claims that sort of are still before the courts. What's going on there?
So you're absolutely right. A lot of federally regulated employers were taking their guidance from the federal government and saying, well, we're also going to implement our own vaccine policies, and we're going to let go or suspend employees that are not vaccinated. For those companies as well now, they can no longer ask or look for the government's mandate as a cover, as a justification. So they have to make decisions as well. And they have to bring employees back or pay them severance. And those cases that are before the courts, and you're right, there's a lot of them. Now the employees have that much stronger cases. Their cases are more straightforward. Their entitlements are even more obvious now because the government has said, wait a second, we don't need these policies anymore. So employers, if you still have those policies, you're on your own. You don't have the backup of the government any longer.
So, Lior, I think, what you just said, we don't need these policies anymore, is kind of key, because it wouldn't be the first time we've seen some back and forth on policies around the pandemic measures, pardon me. But so what happens if restrictions on unvaccinated workers are brought back, for example? Could you be placed on a second leave?
So as I've been saying since vaccines were issued, employers have to take their guidance from the government. So if a government says you have to have your employees vaccinated, then employers obviously have to have those policies, and they can't employ employees that are not vaccinated. But if there are no government policies, if there's no government mandates, employers really are taking a significant risk if they want to do it themselves. So yes, if there are going to be new mandates coming back at some point, hopefully there aren't. But if there are, employers can absolutely follow suit. And in fact, they're going to have to. So we're not necessarily out of the woods yet. We'll know more as we go into the fall. But there is the potential of second round of mandates and potentially layoffs because of vaccines.
And also sort of connected to this is they're changing or talking about changing the definition of fully vaccinated, which could impact a lot of things as well, because if you had none, now all of a sudden you potentially have to have three, obviously affecting the workforce. So let's get to, so the federal mandate is what we're talking about, but a lot of provincially regulated companies still have vaccine policies in place. What happens there?
Yeah, and even for those individuals that really have nothing to do with the federal government, or those employers, I should say, they at least were able to say, well, the government, the federal government, is still saying vaccines are important in the workplace. So provincially regulated employers were using that as a bit of as a cover or justification. Now, again, for those employers, provincially regulated, they don't have that anymore. So employers that insist on having these policies and decide to let go employees that are not vaccinated are definitely exposed to wrongful dismissal claims, and there's many right now in front of the courts. So I think these employers now have significant liability. We're already starting to see those cases settle and resolve. So employers really should always think, is it necessary? Is the government telling us we have to? And if the government is not telling them that, they really are on their own and they have liability.
Finally, Lior, without a lot of time left, let's talk about notice. Can-Do Energy gave their energies 24 hours to come back in person. What's the law around that? How much notice do you have to give employees?
Well, the key word here is reasonable. You need to be given reasonable amount of notice to come back to work. You've structured your life around working remotely. You can't just be told, come back tomorrow. And if you don't come back, that's not a resignation. So employers should give that notice or be prepared to pay employees that are not coming back. They have not resigned.
Lior, always great to see you. We appreciate all your time and your insight. Employment lawyer Lior Samfiru.